Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for May 21st, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we have a really exciting program because we've got not one, but two guests. But first, I'm going to throw it over to Jim and say, hey, Jim, how's it going? Jim Clausing is always on the show. How's it going, Jim?
It's good. I'm not always, but I am alive.
Well, almost always. You're one of our anchors, our main staple anchors on the show. The next person we have here on the couch is Manny Ortiz. Manny is, I guess, your director at AT&T here. You manage the security analysts and oversee and keep us all on track.
That's right.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
And then and you've been on the show before, but Joe is one of the new comers to the show here, and Joe Harten is director also at AT&T here in the security space. And can you tell us a little bit about what you do, Joe?
I do more software, security software stuff. We have a threat platform. Actually, we collect the threats that Manny's team takes a look at. So I'm in security because we all work in the security organization. So I try to keep up on the security threats that are out there. But sort of my main day job is as a software platform engineer.
Right. So your team builds all the back office infrastructure that we use as analysts to try to do security analysis and whatnot. So without your team doing what you do, we really can't do our jobs.
Yeah. Correct.
So I appreciate that, and welcome to the show.
Yep. Symbiosis.
Yes. So the first story I think we have here is one that Joe is going to look at, and being one of our big data experts, I guess, because you kind of facilitate that in the back end on our systems, this is a good one for you to cover about a ZooKeeper vulnerability.
Yeah, so Apache ZooKeeper had a bug this week, and it sort of piqued my interest because we do a lot of work with open source database clustering capabilities, and ZooKeeper is a cluster coordinator. It's sort of a layer on top of a cluster that you can report back to, and it keeps track of all the nodes. So it's definitely something that my team has worked with. So it was interesting to me. After I did the investigation, I checked with our lab folks, and it turns out we're safe. So I don't need to worry about anything being a problem. But what happened here was that the guys at PagerDuty, which is a third-party operations team, they'll do your system management for you. They'll do some alerting. They found that in one of their clusters, they use ZooKeeper, they found some unexpected spawned processes. So I think it was like 10 or 12 processes that they didn't expect to see, and they tracked it down. They dug into it and did a whole investigation. They found it to be a poison packet that sort of took advantage of a length setting within the code base there. And their conclusion was that they found out they could take down the whole cluster with one of these poison packets, which wasn't necessarily the intention. They sort of just stumbled upon it. But
right, it was actually a bug in the way their IPsec wrapping was happening and the TCP checksum. So there's a bug in the system that was creating this erroneous packet. It wasn't an intentional poison packet. It was one that was artificially getting generated in their system due to another
but
bug.
If you injected it on purpose.
Yes, yeah. If you were a malicious actor, they uncovered a vulnerability in ZooKeeper, that someone maliciously could exploit.
So it was a pretty cool investigation. It was a good read. Ars Technica picked it up off their blog, and they're saying that it's only an issue in Linux, the 3+ kernel, anything over 3. So if you're on the 2.6 kernel, you're safe. The Apache ZooKeeper project has a fix in their 3.5 release, but that's only an alpha. So they're saying that in the 3.4 versions, it's not a blocker. But so if you're out there using ZooKeeper, you might want to check to see if this is popping up if you're on the Linux 3 kernel. So
right, and when I was reading through it, The 3.0 kernel vulnerability, I think, might have been with respect to the fact that they were using IPsec, because they looked at the actual code, and the IPsec kernel code in Linux 3.0 says, oh, I don't have to validate if my TCP and UDP checksums are okay, because I'm just going to assume, I guess, that it's okay, because IPsec is wrapping around it. Right. But all that being said, this is a really, to me, interesting, it's a really good read, because in the process of finding one bug in ZooKeeper, they backtracked and found 3 additional bugs that progressively go all the way down through the operating system they were on, down into the Zen hypervisor that they were running under, down into the actual Intel instruction set that does some AES encryption, which is really interesting that they found this whole kind of chain of connection between all of this that bubbled up into this one bug. So it was a really, probably pretty hard to manifest. However, the real impetus behind it is that ZooKeeper, as a software package, was not doing bounds checking on this one value. So they, like you said, initially they noticed, hey, we're getting packets here that say you need to allocate 1.7 gig of memory for what's coming in the protocol here, where really it shouldn't ever go above some smaller number. And then Java goes, oh, I'm going to go allocate 1.7 gig of memory. And they go, out of memory error. And then that thread died. And then the whole thing kind of cascaded from that point. So it's an interesting little bug. So even if you're not Linux 3.0 kernel, I would say check your ZooKeeper, make sure that you're updated on the latest patch. Because that, one of the things I always say about development is when you're a developer, you should always do bounds checking, because you don't want to trust that what's coming up to you from the underlying operating system or your network stack is going to be true. You need to make sure, always sanitize user input and even other things that come off the network, because we see that all the time with network protocols where they define what they're supposed to do, but people don't put these bounds checking in because they assume that the protocol or the underlying TCP layer is going to handle any kind of weird misconfigurations in a packet. So
it's always good programming practice.
Yeah,
it's just plain and simple.
But I was really into this, obviously. I was really into the story. I was like, wow, this is a really interesting one, because it was such an interesting chain of events, and the way they found all these various bugs all the way down through to the bottom level. So the next story we have is back to Jim again, and sounds like the Apple Watch, which we're all coveting. I haven't gotten one myself yet.
I don't think I've seen one.
I haven't seen one either, but my wife won't let me get one, so because she said I'll be too nerdy. Not that I'm not already nerdy enough, but in any event,
Which stinks because we've all been waiting for you to actually get the watch.
Yeah,
for us to see it.
If I can get one, I will. So I'll let you know when I do. It'll be on the show.
All right.
In any event, so there's some updates. I guess it's the first update for Apple Watch, right, Jim?
Yeah. As you said, the Apple Watch has only been out a couple of weeks, and just this week, Apple released the first security update for it. Basically, we talk about these. We talk about these updates on the show on a regular basis, and just like any other, computer, any desktop, laptop, we talk about the Internet of Things, Brian's favorite Internet of insecure things, and how there are updates for those. Well, these wearable devices are going to be the same way. This is the first one. Just like any other device, when the updates come out, you need to be applying them. I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that the update is out there, and get people thinking wearables, just like laptops and desktops and your phones and your any other Internet of Things type devices. The updates keep coming. You need to make sure you're applying them in a timely fashion.
All right, thanks. So moving on to the next story is the NetUSB driver flaw, and I think Manny, you had looked at this one, right?
So obviously this is another a new vulnerability dubbed the CVE 2015-3036. It's basically found in the NetUSB component, and it's basically, they're saying, affecting possibly millions and millions
of different vendors, right?
Yes, routers and embedded devices. So we're just talking about Internet of Things. These could potentially have this NetUSB component as part of some of these other devices, not just routers. So what it basically is, it's another buffer overflow. It's a kernel stack buffer overflow. It's in the Taiwan-based K-Codes NetUSB. And I guess for those who don't know, if you ever looked at your sort of your home router, you probably noticed at one point that there is a USB port.
Right. Some of them do, right?
Some of them do, right?
More recent routers have like USB ports on them to hook up.
Like plug your printer in, and then all of a sudden now you have
now
a
it's network enabled, and everybody can get to it on your local network.
Exactly.
Is the idea.
Right, exactly. That's the way it's supposed to work. But yeah, and so many people probably end up using them for plugging in external drives.
Right.
So now it's accessible by anybody who's on that network. So very convenient, obviously. So much so that we'll find out also that that it's so convenient that they actually turn this stuff on by default. So, so there's
even if you don't have anything plugged into it.
Correct. Right. That's the problem. So it's again, there is it's limited to a certain set of vendors out there, but there is quite a few. As you'll see from the website, there's quite a lengthy list of
a lot of vendor
vendors.
names that you'd recognize. They all use this K-Codes NetUSB, I guess, library or code base as part of their router firmware or whatever.
Right. So, just real quickly, it's basically triggered when a client sends the computer name over TCP port 20,005, longer than 64 characters, to a server on that device, right?
So on the local area network.
Correct.
If I can locally hit that router from the local network.
Right, and then basically it's going to overflow the actual computer name kernel stack buffer. And then basically once that happens, you're now able to run arbitrary code on it.
Game over.
And you can DOS the device.
Or probably do some remote code execution. Maybe do some additional things.
Absolutely.
If you know what target device you're targeting.
Yeah, and then obviously to make matters even worse, the really bad stuff is that the NetUSB service code, it actually runs in the kernel mode. So once a hacker is able to exploit, their malicious code can run at the kernel level.
Right.
So, and like you said before, it's on by default. So these routers that actually have the USB port, you'll find out that they're actually have this turned on by default. And some of them have no way to turn it off, which is a problem. And then as of when I read through this article, the only manufacturer TP-Link was the only one so far that has actually provided a patch or a fix for it.
Okay. All right. Well, it'll probably take a little while for all the vendors to integrate that into their products, as they have to get notified and understand how this vulnerability works.
Right. Yep.
And as Brian is always pointing out, these are the kinds of devices that, since they don't automatically update themselves, the user at home has to know that they need to update the firmware. So this could linger for a while. But it's also another example of just what you were talking about a little bit ago, John, where the lack of bounds checking in the folks' code. They assume, since the computer name should only be 64 characters, that it'll get truncated someplace else. So.
Yeah, how could somebody possibly have a computer name that's longer than 64 characters, right?
Go figure. I guess that's what the developers were thinking,
that's
right?
Exactly what they were thinking.
So, John, in this CVE, I looked into it, and they include some proof of concept code for an exploit. They say they're holding back the actual exploit that they've developed, but they put basically some pseudocode for an exploit. Is that something that is standard? I mean, it seems a little dangerous to me that we're publishing something that a hacker could take and use to exploit a vulnerability that's pretty new, that maybe hasn't even entered the wild yet.
Well, I mean, explaining kind of at a high level how it works, I don't know if that's necessarily so bad. I think it's good that they held back the actual exploit code. They probably gave that to the vendors like K-Codes and some of the other vendors, because you want them to understand, be able to replicate the problem, right? But yeah, I wouldn't be an advocate of releasing
we don't want to make it too easy,
vulnerabilities
right?
widespread.
Right.
Yeah, I don't want to make it too easy. But the problem is there's a lot of smart people out there,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
they're probably going to figure it out before the vendors get this fixed.
Yeah, there's
true.
already enough information that's been released for the wheels to start turning.
Yeah, and that's not unusual. You've got a lot of very good lateral thinkers in the security realm out there who can see something like this and say, oh, I know where this probably is in the code branch. And I can figure out what they're talking about here. For the most part, this is locally exploitable only. They did mention in the article that there might be a few vendors that are exposing this NetUSB on the internet WAN side, but they didn't identify which ones or that it was, in any kind of widespread kind of issue. And I guess the other point I wanted to point out was Jim said, a lot of people who have these devices, they need to be made aware that this is a problem and that they need to patch, but everybody's watching ThreatTraq, so now they're informed, right?
That's right.
Everybody watches the show.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding, obviously.
Okay.
Okay.
And plus, it doesn't have a fancy nickname or,
Right, yeah,
it
this
has
is a
its
very boring, and this is, well, we're going to get into this in the next story, If you named every vulnerability CVE 2015-3036, the media would
so
not
catchy.
care at all about this vulnerability, but when you call it logjam or shell shock, everybody goes, oh, what does that mean? They all get nervous, right? And that actually leads into our next story here.
Right.
There was an interesting article put out, more of a blog type article that was put out on the internet about stunt hacking, and I guess you wanted to tee this one up, right, Manny?
Yeah. So again, I think this one's just sort of to throw it out there and see about some discussion. But basically, it's about this thing called stunt hacking, and which is basically creating this media frenzy around some, about some vulnerability for the sake of just creating the frenzy or for basically increasing name recognition. If you're the researcher involved in actually looking at this, then my name's out there, I found it, now I'm going to...
trying to make a name for themselves or for their company that they might represent so that they can get more business.
Yep.
And then you've got all these people who probably pile onto that, say, hey, we've got a new appliance that can detect this new whatchamadoozit vulnerability and protect you from it. So you get all these other people that kind of pile on to the hype. And I guess, I think we do a fairly good job, I'm going to say, about not hyping things, or at least like in our initial story with Logjam, we kind of told you the title of the story said, the world's ending, HTTPS web servers, tens of thousands vulnerable. But we're like, hey, it's not really that bad. The sky is not falling here. So we try to give you some grounding. But there are a lot of people, especially media, I think, that tend to misinterpret or maybe just try to make things seem bigger than they are. And I'm not really crazy about this whole naming of vulnerabilities like shell shock and logjam and heartbleed.
But I mean, is any PR good PR? I mean, without some of those names, is this security world that we work in nearly as relevant? I mean, you could look at it the other way. If shell shock gets headlines, maybe people know what we're doing and know what to go patch. So I think
that's a decent counterpoint.
Yeah.
However, they're probably not going to patch it themselves. They're going to ask somebody who's more of a security vendor to understand.
And say,
right.
But in a way, it's bringing some eyes onto something that, only the nerds typically would know about. And maybe now if it's a headline in the New York Times, even if it's on page 4, maybe it gets a little more awareness to it. But I still think you're right, that the hype factor and the way sometimes, the article kind of said that people almost be hired for this, like make us some press on, go out and get something that we know you can get into it, and then we'll release the press release. Yeah, that's kind of,
unscrupulous.
Right. Good one.
Yeah. And I also don't like the fake outrage that sometimes you see. Like the security researcher will say, can you believe that they made such a stupid mistake when they wrote this code or something? I'm like, come on, people make mistakes.
It's the bash shell. How could you violate the bash shell?
Yeah, everybody uses this. What are you, nuts? How could you make such a big mistake? But people make mistakes.
Right.
If we didn't, then,
Yeah, and one of the points that they made, which I totally agree with, is that a lot of what he was trying to say was that the research that goes into figuring out what's going on, sometimes there is actually some good research behind
absolutely.
that. Very good research. But unfortunately, that hype takes over, and that research that was done, the real good stuff, just gets sort of buried in the background, and it all becomes about the hype, the name, and so that's what gets glorified, and then the poor research and the good stuff just gets sort of tucked away.
Right.
And that's unfortunate.
And a lot of times it's not even the research, like the researcher who did the research and figured out this vulnerability sometimes isn't responsible for the hype. It's maybe who they work for, or just some media company that picks up on it and says, hey, the sky is falling, this new vulnerability here. And then you get phone calls from your family and friends. Hey, can I go on the internet today?
Right.
I saw something. And they're like, no, it's not that bad. It's not a big deal, because people don't understand, and it just gets overhyped.
And like you said earlier, I think at least for this show, I think we do a pretty good job of trying to let folks know when there is this sense of hype around something. So, I mean, we'll try to do some research behind it ourselves to look and say, hey, look, they're glorifying this, but really, let's try to get down to the nuts and bolts.
We'll give details that a New York Times story won't give. We'll tell you what the specific overflow is, or what the string that's the culprit really is. We're not just going to give you a sort of very uninformed view of what the media thinks the problem is.
Okay, so that was a good little discussion on that, and I think we've kind of danced around that topic before with a lot of these other vulnerabilities when they come out. So it's actually a good read. His blog article. So we'll put a link to that on the show notes. So let's go into the internet weather, and we had talked about the NetUSB vulnerability there just a few minutes ago. I was just kind of curious, so I looked in our internet weather to see, hey, is anybody scanning on port 20,005 TCP? And sure enough, there is. And that article came out on May 19th, and you could see somewhere in the afternoon on May 19th, somebody started scanning for it, and then they did another scan a little bit after there. It's not a lot, and when I looked at it, it's predominantly from sources in the US associated with a security research team. So this is some good guys that are probably trying to assess the threat landscape. We said that from their report that it's pretty much only locally exploitable. You got to be on the local LAN, but that they said, well, there might be a couple of vendors out there who are exposing this on the internet side. So that's probably what they're looking for here. And I don't think certainly security research time, probably not for malicious intent. But there were some lesser amounts from a couple of these US cloud dedicated server hosting ISPs where you can get like your server your own. I don't know who they are or who's behind that activity, but to a lesser degree, there were some other actors doing the scanning as well. So something to keep an eye on. If you have, it's probably a good idea to read that story and then check if one of your devices is vulnerable to this. It's a lot of these home Soho type routers for the most part. So if you do have that at home or in a small business, you'd want to go make sure that gets patched when patches are available, and whether or not it's exploitable on the internet side. So, in terms of the top 10 most probe ports, these are the ports that are scanned the most, just in sheer volume, not necessarily how many people are scanning them. So like one person could blow this whole chart out by scanning a bazillion attempts on a particular port. So I actually prefer the next chart a little bit better. But in general, there is a couple of interesting changes here, because somebody did blow the chart out here. Particularly with port 135 TCP, you'll see that it jumped up from position 23 to position 3 on the top 10 chart here. But we'll just walk through these real quick. So Telnet, port 23 TCP, and then SSH is the next one, port 22 TCP. We always know those are scanned a lot because they provide some sort of remote administration to the endpoint devices. 135 TCP is your Microsoft endpoint mapper. We're going to go take a look at a chart on that in a minute. Your 445 TCP, which is your SMB, that's mostly Conficker and other types of malware that's still looking for that old vulnerability that are out there still scanning for that. 8080 TCP is an alternate HTTP port. We see this a lot. There's a lot of like proxies hang out on this. Tomcat hangs out on this. There's some other content management systems that might have an administrative port on that port. So they're looking for various things. A lot of it is proxy oriented though, that when we actually look in our sinkhole or our honeypot traffic, we see that it looks like they're mostly looking for proxies. 443 TCP and 80 TCP as your web type traffic has moved up a little bit in the 443 TCP, down quite a bit in 80 TCP. We're actually going to go take a look at 80 TCP and why it's down so much from last week. You know, it went down 6 positions here. And then you've got your 53 UDP, which is DNS, 1900 UDP, which is your Simple Service Discovery Protocol, which there's a lot of activity of reflection scanning. So just like you could do DNS reflection scanning, or it's not scanning, DNS reflection attacks, where you reflect packets, they're doing that with SSDP, as well as 123 UDP, which is the network time protocol. So they use that for reflection attacks as well. So sometimes those get into the mix here. Looks like scanning, but in reality, it's probably attack traffic or people looking for devices. They could be scanning, looking for ones that will respond to that so that they can use it as part of their attack surface. So here's the 135 TCP. So remember how we said it moved up 20 positions there. We've had reported on this once before in the show, quite a ways back. So I guess you can kind of see here back in the March, this is a 60-day picture here. In the March and April timeframe, this was pretty elevated. We had a lot of activity, and then all of a sudden it went away. And it's been away for quite a while, and all of a sudden it kicked up again. So basically they're back. This is predominantly sources in China doing this scanning. To what end, I'm not quite sure. I did capture a couple of samples way back when it was happening in the March, April timeframe, but I don't remember what was in there, so I have to go find that again. One notable aspect of this scanning activity is they're using a static source port. So when you look at all the scanning activity, it's got a static source port of 4445, which normally, if something's making connections over and over again in scanning, that ephemeral port will keep incrementing. In this case, it's static, which is
so the scanning stopped this week and picked back up?
No, it stopped like April 16th, I'm going to say here.
Okay.
If you look at this, where it dips down here, and it's been down since about April 16th until May 17th or so. So May 17th is where it just kicked up again here, and that's where this big ramp up occurred here. Okay. The point I was going to make about that static source port is probably they're using a tool like ZMap or MassScan to do some of this, scanning en masse, where they just kind of sit and listen on that ephemeral port and wait for packets to come back. And if they get a packet back, they know that something's listening on there, instead of trying to actually build actual TCP connections.
Do we know if the scan sources have changed since it went away, or is it?
I believe it was from China before,
okay.
From what I remember. Actually, I know it was. I don't know if the address blocks that were involved are exactly the same, but we could go back and look at that. Okay. So I probably should. I just didn't get a chance to this morning.
Okay.
If it continues next week, we'll take a look and we'll see what it looks like. So the 80 TCP went down quite a bit from last week. And you'll notice there's this huge amount of traffic, and I think Brian covered this last week. I wasn't on the show last week, but I'm pretty sure I did some research on this and helped him for the show. So I think he had discussed this one. This is actually looks like scanning to us from our reporting systems, but what was really happening here is there was a big SYN flood against the game server hosting ISP in China. I'm not quite sure what kind of game servers they host. I looked at it, their web page, and it didn't translate in Chinese very well because a lot of it was graphic images that I don't speak Chinese, but in any event, it looked like this was more of a denial of service attack that occurred against them. For what purposes, I don't know. But when they were targeting, instead of targeting specific IPs, which we see a lot of times in denial of service attacks, they basically targeted every IP in a whole /23 address block that they manage, this game server hosting ISP.
So this is from last week we're looking at?
Yeah, so this big lump here, this is a 30-day picture. So this is about the May 8th time frame until May 14th, I'm going to say, is where all these big spikes occur.
So would you say we're back to a normal range?
Yes, we're back to a normal range now, yeah. So that's why it's gone down to normal again. And in terms of volume, AT TCP scanning is usually pretty high. It doesn't look high in here, but it actually is, because we're talking about it's not gigabytes, it's whatever, billions of flows per hour that we would normally see, and it went up to a lot more. It's like a 10 times increase here in terms of how much above the normal baseline we would normally see here. So that was pretty significant when it was going on last week. So this chart's the top 10 most sources probing. I like this chart a lot more because it basically means you've got a lot of sources doing something in unison together, which is usually an indication of botnet type activity or scanning that's occurring in some orderly fashion, like somebody's telling them to all to do it, like a botnet. So no big surprise, 23 TCP is still high. It was last week #1 position. It is again this week. A lot of telnet scanning going on. I have some theories about what this is. It's probably some of these botnets going after these vulnerable routers, home routers. We've seen a lot of like the Linksys Moon botnet, which targets a lot of these home routers. And they are generally targeting 23 TCP because a lot of them have them open, exposed to the internet, which is not good. And a lot of times people buy these devices, they put it in their home network, and they plug it in, they plug all their stuff in, they say, I'm done. But they don't realize that it's got the default password on there of admin, or whatever. So people get in, they put or bad guys get in, they put their malware on there, and now they're using your home router for some other purpose of their own to do some kind of botnet operations. So.
Yeah, well, and just like last week, though, the size of that slice of the pie is much larger than what we're used to seeing for any of them.
It's pretty significant. Yeah, it's almost probably, I can't do the math, I'm going to say like 40%, 35% of the chart, something like that maybe, right?
Yeah, it's more than a third, it looks like.
Yeah, it's pretty significant. But not as significant as it might have been in the past. So I'm going to show you a chart on that in a second here. Let's just run through these. I don't think there's anything really too interesting in here. We've talked about 4045 TCP. BitTorrent is in here. I don't really have a good explanation for this. So you've got the 6881 UDP and 6881 TCP, which have both jumped up a few positions from previous weeks. When I look at the actual chart, like a graph that we would show in the previous ones there, it really doesn't show any like huge swings in change of activity. So, even though it's moved up a couple of positions here, I don't think it's a giant change from its normal baseline. The 27015 UDP is Half-Life gaming server. This is not security relevant. This is just a kind of artifact of how that protocol works. 17788 UDP, we're attributing to this protocol called PP Stream, which is kind of a video streaming protocol that I don't really know a whole lot about, but we believe that that's probably what this activity is. I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just another kind of peer-to-peer thing that's kind of artificially looking like scanning, but maybe not really, really malicious in nature. Here's the 23 TCP chart. And so here's where we are today. We're at about, what is this, like 80,000 scan sources per hour, which is pretty significant. I think that's what we're looking at. Yeah, it's like 70 or 80,000 per hour. But in the past, we had gotten up to like 150,000. So this is back in the January timeframe of this year. So January 8th or 9th, I'm going to say, is this top peak here of about 150,000 scan sources per hour. So that was about double what it was today. Still, it's pretty significant. This is a lot of scanning activity. I'm not showing the actual amount of scanning activity as so much as I'm showing the number of sources participating in this activity. This also shows we've talked about this before, this kind of sawtooth waveform that you see, which is basically an artifact of the fact that a botnet operator might say, tell all his bots, okay, go start scanning. And you've got these FiOS ones, or ones that are on really high-speed networks that complete quicker than other ones on slower networks, their scanning activity. So you kind of get this kind of sawtooth as they decay off here, as some finish and others take longer to finish their jobs that they get scheduled to do for scanning. So that's kind of where we're at now. We're still, this is a lot of activity. So if you have a home router or if you have anything exposed with Telnet, first of all, I'd say, why are you using Telnet? You should be using SSH. And then secondly, I would say, even if you are using SSH, limit your connectivity to only sources that you trust. There's no reason to open that up on the internet to sort to the entire internet. Open it up to sources or address blocks that you know should be able to telnet in or do administrative type activities. That's the show for today. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. The URL's on the screen that you can reference for that. The show's also available on YouTube and iTunes. Please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Manny. Thanks, Joe, for joining me today. Nice to have some new faces on the show. I'm John Hogoboom. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.